Alright guys, welcome to your notes on classification. This is a pretty short set of notes, more of me talking and less of you writing. But I do want you to write down your objectives, understand how the classification system goes from general to more specific. So we'll be talking a little bit about how we organize living things, how we put them into groups, how we distinguish between them. And so like I said, I'm going to just sort of be giving you guys some overviews of these things. And there's only a handful, maybe one or two words that you have to actually define. So we're going to start off talking about the three domains of life. So we take all living things and we break them into three domains. And you can see those here. Every living thing on the planet will fit into one of these three groups. And they are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. This is the largest group. This is sort of the most primitive. Things like extremophiles that like to live in really, really hot places, really, really cold places, really, really deep places. And then these are your sort of basic bacteria that you think of when you think of bacteria. Most of these guys are bacteria as well. So those three domains then get broken up into the kingdoms. And you can see here we've got these four right here all fall into the domain of eukaryota. Eubacteria is the domain bacteria. Archaea bacteria is the domain archaea. So these are kind of two smaller, very specialized groups, whereas this domain of eukaryota is much larger, and the organisms that we're more familiar with. So we'll go through, and I just want to briefly talk about each of the kingdoms. You don't have to write down anything, but I just want to give you sort of some examples of what each kingdom contains. So eubacteria, these are our true bacteria, things that you might think of like E. coli or staph, things that make you sick. Those types of bacteria fall into this kingdom. They are single-celled and they are prokaryotes, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. Then we've got the archaebacteria. These are the most primitive things probably on the planet. Archae literally means ancient, so we've got ancient bacteria. They're chemosynthetic. A lot of them are chemosynthetic. They use chemicals to make their food instead of sunlight, because a lot of them live really, really deep in the ocean, like at these hydrothermal vents that are thousands and thousands of feet underwater, and they're super, super hot, and there's obviously no sunlight. This black smoke-looking thing are clouds of chemicals that these types of bacteria use to create food for themselves. They also live in volcanoes and in ice and all over the place in crazy things. Most scientists agree that these are probably the first things that, first sort of complex organisms, if you will, that evolved on the planet. Then now we get into domain eukaryota, and we have our first kingdom, which is called protista, which is not very different from bacteria. They're not really plants or animals or fungus. That's sort of how we characterize them. Most of them are unicellular, things like amoebas, paramecia. A lot of protists are actually parasites. We'll talk a little bit about parasites later on. Nothing really remarkable about this particular group other than they're not what we know to be plants, animals, or fungus. Kingdom fungi, these guys can be unicellular or multicellular. They absorb their nutrients, they don't consume things, and they don't do photosynthesis. Okay, so they're not a plant. Mushrooms are not plants. But they simply absorb their nutrients, usually through things that are decaying. So you'll often find them, on forest floors in decaying wood, or even growing on trees that maybe are a little bit damp, and there's decay that's happening there, and they can actually extract the nutrients from that. Then we've got the kingdom plantae, so plants. These guys are multicellular. They can be unicellular. Most are photosynthetic. There's a few examples of plants that are not photosynthetic. Most live on land, but there are definitely algae and kelp and things that live in the ocean. So you've got examples of mosses, flowers, trees. So the plant kingdom, we're relatively familiar with that, and we're also relatively familiar with kingdom Animalia. We fall into this category. Multicellular, we have to ingest our nutrients, which means we need to eat, which is why we've got these nice teeth and big mouths. Spiders, rats, sharks, humans, you guys know animals. So when we look at the classification system, you guys saw this the other day in our other set of notes. But remember, it is based on form and structure. That's what Linnaeus came up with. He started grouping things based on sort of what they look like and how they move, how they work. And the groups become more specific as we go from kingdom up through species, or domain up through species. So down here, it's the least specific. We've got lots and lots of organisms. As we go up, we get fewer and fewer organisms until we get up to species where it's most specific. There would only be one organism at this level. So you guys saw an example of that in the notes we took in class on biodiversity about how to classify an organism. So the tiger, for example, fell into the domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and all the way up until we got to the name of the actual species. Now in the genus, there are other organisms that fall into that same genus. We looked at the Royal Bengal tiger, but there are other tigers that fall in that same genus, but their species is a little bit different. Okay, so you've got the Royal Bengal tiger, and you've got so that's an Indian tiger, and then you've also got Asian tigers. So you can see that the species is going to be different for each individual organism. One really easy way to remember the levels of classification is this mnemonic that I learned when I was in high school, so it obviously worked for me. Dumb King Philip chases old fat Girl Scouts. So you take the first letter of each of the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and put it in that order. And if you can remember Dumb King Philip chases old fat Girl Scouts, hopefully you can then remember this. If you can come up with your own mnemonic, I'll give you a couple points extra credit. Bring it into me and I'll check it. So when we get to species, this is kind of the most important one to remember. It's the basic biological unit of classification. That is a definition that you definitely need to write down. Okay, the basic unit of classification, because it's basic because there's only one organism there. And all dogs are the same species. These guys are all the same species, but there's different breeds. I got a picture of Dr. Lupin up here because his name comes from the species name of the dog, Lupus, and actually his first name, Remus, comes from the myth about how the city of Rome was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were abandoned and nursed through their lives by a mother wolf. And so his, if you will, his scientific name, genus, Remus, comes from the Roman mythology of Remus, and then Lupin, comes from the species name of the dog because he is a werewolf. So these guys are all the same species. So if you go all the way back up the list, right here, so if they're all the same species, then they're all also the same genus, same family, same order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain as well. That's another important thing to understand. All right. So I have a summary that I would like you guys to answer. Explain why we now have 6 kingdoms instead of Aristotle's 2 groups of plants and animals. There will be a link for you to answer that question on the daily log sheet. So go back to the daily logs, click on the blue summary link, and answer this question into the Google form. I will see you guys in class.